There are moments in history when the course of nations could have changed with just a twist of fate. Imagine a world where the British crown and the German Empire were ruled by the same man, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The very name might sound absurd at first, but beneath that irony lies one of the most fascinating what-ifs of European history. A man remembered as the warmongering Kaiser of World War I could, under slightly different circumstances, have been the King of Britain too. But history is not written by coincidence. It's written by perception, and few figures have been more misunderstood, more vilified, and more complex than Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II, King of Britain, sounds impossible, doesn't it? Yet the logic is surprisingly simple. Wilhelm was the grandson of Queen Victoria through his mother, Victoria, Princess Royal. Under the rule of absolute primogeniture, where the eldest child inherits the throne regardless of gender, he would have been both the German Kaiser and the British king. But because Britain followed male preference primogeniture, the crown passed elsewhere, and the course of European history was changed forever. Before diving into this alternate reality, it's important to clear away the myths surrounding Wilhelm, myths born from British wartime propaganda and the venomous gossip of his uncle, King Edward VII, a man more infamous for his scandals than his statesmanship. This same Edward oversaw Britain's use of concentration camps during the Boer War, leading to the deaths of over 40,000 people. Yet the British press, then and now, insists that the Windsors were the noble ones, the perpetual good guys, thanks to the reassuring voice of institutions like the BBC. Now, let's set the record straight. Wilhelm was no saint. He had his flaws, his arrogance, and his blunders. But he wasn't the cartoon villain painted by propaganda. To understand him, we must first look at the moment that defined his reign, his break with the legendary Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was a political giant, the architect of German unification. His record was monumental. Denmark crushed in 1864, Austria defeated in 1866, and France humbled in 1871. But as the years went on, Bismarck grew rigid and authoritarian. His crusade against socialism and Catholicism only strengthened both forces. He dismissed the value of colonies as a waste of money until Britain and France had already seized the best territories, forcing Germany to scramble for what was left. When Wilhelm took the throne, Bismarck believed he could manipulate him, censoring correspondence, issuing contradictory orders, and even undermining the emperor's authority by overruling his ministers. It was political sabotage at the highest level. The final straw came in 1889 when a miners' strike broke out. Bismarck wanted to use the strike as an excuse to unleash the army and crush the socialists through bloodshed. Wilhelm, who saw himself as a father to his people, refused to support such brutality. He believed that a ruler's duty was to care for his subjects, not terrorize them. In his own words, Wilhelm later said, "The conflict between the Chancellor and me arose because of his belief that social problems could be solved by soldiers, not by principles of general love for mankind." That moment sealed Bismarck's fate. In 1890, after years of tension, Wilhelm forced the Iron Chancellor to resign. The web of alliances Bismarck had built began to unravel soon after, but Wilhelm had set Germany on a new course, one driven by reform rather than repression. Despite his later image as a tyrant, Wilhelm wasn't a totalitarian ruler. He genuinely cared for his people and believed his power came with moral responsibility. He introduced labor reforms, improved working conditions, and sought to reconcile the crown with the working class. In 1889, he convened an international conference in Berlin to push for shorter work hours, safer workplaces, and fairer wages. 2 years later, the Workers' Protection Act introduced accident insurance and restrictions on child labor, long before similar laws existed in Britain or America. Germany, under Wilhelm, also had universal male suffrage, something Britain would not achieve until decades later. The result was striking. Germany's economy exploded, overtaking Britain's in industrial growth, and German workers stopped emigrating to America in search of opportunity. This rapid progress made Britain uneasy, and jealousy began to grow across the Channel. Yet for all the rivalry that would later define Anglo-German relations, Wilhelm himself felt deeply connected to Britain. He had spent his youth visiting his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and saw himself as a link between the two nations. In 1889, he wrote, "The friendship with the English, sealed in my blood, my honored grandfather maintained to the end of his life." Later, as Kaiser, he declared, "The peace of the world depends on the maintenance of good relations between Germany and England." His bond with Queen Victoria was profound. The two exchanged letters constantly, and she trusted him more than most of her own children. She was one of the first to warn him about Bismarck's manipulations and encouraged him to think independently. When she fell gravely ill in 1901, Wilhelm rushed to her side. He sat by her bed, holding her head in his arms for over an hour until she passed, a moment that symbolized not just their closeness, but the end of an era. With her death and the rise of Edward VII, the fragile hope for lasting peace between Germany and Britain faded into the background. And so, history turned its course. The man who might have united two great empires instead became the symbol of their rivalry. Wilhelm II, a monarch torn between two identities, a grandson of Britain's beloved queen and the emperor of its greatest rival, stands as a reminder that the story of history is never simple. It is written by perception, shaped by politics, and remembered through the eyes of those who won the war of words, not necessarily the war itself. In 1913, just 1 year before Europe was plunged into the chaos of the First World War, British peer Charles Harbord, the 5th Baron of Scotsfield and a personal friend of King Edward III, wrote words that would later stand in stark contrast to the propaganda of the coming years. He described Kaiser Wilhelm II not as the warmonger he would later be portrayed as, but as a man who had always held a deep affection for England and the English people. In spite of all that people say to the contrary, Harbord wrote, he has invariably worked for peace with England. To Harbord, Wilhelm's efforts were sincere, his motives genuine, and yet, despite his continuous attempts to foster friendship and understanding, there was always an undercurrent of friction between the two royal courts, a tension that he insisted could not be laid at the emperor's feet. It was an early recognition that Wilhelm's tragedy was not rooted in malice, but in a world increasingly resistant to his vision of reconciliation. The myth of a German-driven naval arms race, one of the cornerstones of British pre-war propaganda, deserves the same scrutiny. Contrary to the popular story that Wilhelm sought to challenge Britain's dominance at sea, the reality was far more pragmatic. Germany never believed it could rival the Royal Navy, nor did it intend to. Wilhelm himself explained the logic behind his naval expansion in an 1898 telegram, stating that just as the German army had secured peace on land, so too would the Navy secure peace at sea. His words were not a threat, but a declaration of intent, a recognition that Germany's growing empire required the means to defend its trade routes and overseas territories. The purpose of his fleet was not conquest, but security. This interpretation was not limited to German circles. One of Britain's own leading naval architects, Sir Edward Reed, defended Wilhelm's reasoning in plain terms. Reed wrote that the German Empire's increasing global interests demanded a proportionate expansion of its maritime forces. He argued that without a capable navy, Germany could neither protect its commerce nor sustain its colonies, and that its desire to strengthen its fleet was entirely legitimate and honorable. Reed even urged his countrymen to view Germany's naval ambitions in a friendly light, as the natural course of a modern power securing its place in a globalized world. But such nuance found little traction in the increasingly paranoid climate of early 20th century Europe. When viewed from a distance, a clearer image of Wilhelm II begins to emerge, a man caught between his role as emperor and the political storms of his age. He was neither the reckless militarist nor the erratic tyrant portrayed by later wartime caricatures. Instead, he was a ruler who consistently sought common ground with Britain. During the Boer War, at a time when nearly every nation condemned British actions in South Africa, Wilhelm extended his support to London. He rejected repeated invitations from Russia and France to exploit Britain's vulnerability and attack her empire. He advocated dialogue, even when British diplomats used negotiations as a cover for espionage. But despite his gestures of goodwill, every hand he extended was met with cold suspicion. By 1907, the hopes for peace between the two nations had all but evaporated. In private, British statesman Arthur Balfour confided that to preserve its supremacy, Britain might one day have to destroy Germany. It was a chilling admission, and it underscored the futility of Wilhelm's mission. He had tried everything: personal diplomacy, royal alliances, and even direct appeals to reason, but the tide of politics was moving in the opposite direction. Desperate to preserve peace in Europe, Wilhelm managed to sign an alliance with his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Yet, almost as soon as the ink dried, Russian politicians withdrew their support, bowing to pressures from anti-German factions within their own government. It is often forgotten that, in the years leading up to the Great War, Wilhelm II was widely regarded as a peacemaker. He was praised not only in Germany, but also abroad. American figures such as Theodore Roosevelt, Andrew Carnegie, and William Howard Taft spoke highly of him, as did several respected voices in France and Britain. His efforts were visible, his intentions clear. He sought a balance between German power and a lasting European peace. The tragedy lay not in his ambition, but in Europe's refusal to accept it. To understand Wilhelm's position, one must travel further back in time to 1837, when the death of King William IV without an heir changed the course of history. With no male successor, Britain adopted absolute primogeniture, placing Queen Victoria on the throne. Her firstborn child, Princess Victoria, was educated with the expectation that she would one day rule, or, at the very least, wield considerable influence through marriage. In 1858, she wed Frederick of Prussia, uniting two great royal houses in what Queen Victoria hoped would be a stabilizing alliance. At the time, Prussia ranked as only the fourth strongest power in Europe, behind France, Austria, and Russia. Yet the Queen saw promise in the union, believing that British influence could temper Prussian militarism and bring balance to the continent. A year later, in 1859, their son Wilhelm was born. His upbringing reflected both worlds, Prussian discipline and British refinement. He learned the political systems, values, and customs of both nations, embodying what his grandmother believed to be the future of Europe, a bridge between German might and British civility. For a time, this dream seemed within reach. But history would soon twist that vision into irony. As Prussia's influence expanded under Otto von Bismarck, defeating Austria in 1866 and France in 1871, the British Parliament began to grow uneasy. Some members even suggested cutting the Prussian line from royal succession, fearing that Britain's interests would one day clash with those of a unified Germany. Queen Victoria, however, dismissed such talk. She adored her grandson Wilhelm, whom she affectionately referred to as Willie, and saw in him the very embodiment of her imperial legacy. To her, he was a young man of discipline, integrity, and vision, qualities she found lacking in her own sons, particularly Edward, whose hedonism scandalized the monarchy. Victoria went so far as to rally her most trusted politicians, like Benjamin Disraeli and Lord Salisbury, to ensure continued support for her Prussian descendants. In her eyes, Wilhelm would one day represent not just Germany, but the continuation of the moral and imperial standards she held dear. During his youth, Wilhelm frequently traveled to Britain, attending major public events such as the opening of the Thames Embankment in 1871. He was greeted warmly by the British public, who saw him not as a foreigner, but as one of their own, a German prince with distinctly British manners. Many believed he could serve as a bridge between two empires whose destinies seemed intertwined. But that optimism began to fade during the Second Boer War. The conflict exposed deep fractures in international politics. While much of Europe denounced Britain's actions in South Africa, Wilhelm refused to join in the chorus of condemnation. Instead, he offered to mediate peace and sought to eliminate anti-British sentiment within Germany. By 1899, as the war intensified, he made a bold move, accepting an invitation to visit England and openly showing solidarity with his grandmother's empire. It was a gesture that infuriated France and Russia, both of whom quietly supported the Boers through volunteers and financial aid, but it underscored Wilhelm's loyalty to family and his commitment to Anglo-German friendship. The decision was not without domestic backlash. German nationalists accused him of being overly enamored with Britain, and whispers began circulating that his brother, Prince Heinrich, should replace him on the throne. Still, Wilhelm pressed on, strengthening diplomatic channels and ensuring that Germany's support for Britain remained visible. When the war finally ended in 1902 with a British victory, Wilhelm's position was vindicated. His critics fell silent, and even those in Britain who had doubted him began to view him as an honorable ally. For a brief moment, it seemed as though his lifelong dream, a genuine partnership between Britain and Germany, might be realized. But that moment passed swiftly. Within a decade, the old suspicions resurfaced, the alliances shifted, and Europe once again spiraled toward division. When the guns of August 1914 thundered across the continent, Wilhelm's legacy was sealed, not as the peacemaker he had aspired to be, but as the villain history demanded. The truth, however, remains far more complex. He was not the architect of conflict, but a man crushed beneath the weight of forces he could no longer control. Queen Victoria had lived to see her vision of a strong Anglo-German understanding become reality. For decades, she had dreamed of a Europe bound together not by rivalry, but by shared heritage and cooperation between the great powers of Britain and Germany. Yet fate, as it so often does, intervened cruelly. In January of 1901, her long reign came to an end. She passed away before she could witness the long-term fruits of the diplomacy and dynastic marriages she had so carefully cultivated. Her death marked the close of an era, one defined by industrial progress, imperial expansion, and a monarch who had become the symbolic matriarch of Europe. Following her passing, the crown was inherited by her daughter, who ascended the throne as Queen Victoria II, Wilhelm's mother. But destiny seemed to conspire against stability. Only months later, in August of that same year, she too passed away. With the British crown vacant once again, her son, Wilhelm, already Emperor of Germany, journeyed to London. There, before crowds that stretched beyond the horizon, he was crowned as King William V of Great Britain. The cheers that erupted across the capital marked one of the most extraordinary moments in modern European history. For the first time, the same man now ruled over both the British and German empires. Although the two crowns remained distinct in law, the personal union between the Hohenzollern and Hanover lines signaled the dawn of a new age. In the early days of his rule, Britain's reaction was divided. Many common citizens were uneasy, uncertain what it meant to have a German-born monarch sitting upon the British throne. Yet, among the upper echelons of power, especially within the Conservative Party, a different sentiment prevailed. To the Tories, Wilhelm's accession represented a golden opportunity. They saw in him a chance to merge Britain's vast imperial network with Germany's surging industrial might. With American tariffs limiting trade, they envisioned a future in which British merchants could bypass these barriers through German manufacturing power. They welcomed the Kaiser with cautious enthusiasm, believing they could guide him to serve Britain's interests. Wilhelm, for his part, wasted little time in asserting his authority. His first major act was the suppression of the Boer resistance in South Africa, a move that made him immensely popular among both the British public and conservative elites. In Germany, however, opinions were more mixed. Some within the conservative establishment feared that the dual monarchy would stretch the empire's resources too thin, while others whispered that perhaps Prince Heinrich might have been the more suitable figure to lead such a complex union. But Wilhelm saw the Anglo-German partnership as destiny itself, a sacred union of what he called the Teutonic race. In practice, Wilhelm's ability to personally govern two vast empires was limited. The daily affairs of state in both London and Berlin were increasingly handled by their respective ministers, as the monarch found himself consumed by diplomatic and symbolic duties. Still, his presence at the head of both empires reshaped Europe's balance of power. Inevitably, intrigue followed. In London, British intelligence uncovered several French-backed conspiracies aimed at toppling Wilhelm and restoring the crown to Edward. Edward himself, however, had no involvement in these plots. The culprits were swiftly arrested and dealt with, and the stability of the monarchy remained intact. The reaction in France was one of horror. The Anglo-German Union represented a nightmare for Paris, the unification of two of Europe's most industrialized, powerful states under a single sovereign. French leaders briefly considered war to prevent it. Yet, after remembering their humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, their resolve collapsed almost immediately. In true French fashion, they blustered, postured, and then retreated. Russia, too, watched the situation with growing alarm. The Tsar understood that the combined forces of Britain and Germany were unmatched. War with such an alliance would mean disaster for the Russian Empire. At Germany's insistence, Austria-Hungary was invited into this new system of alliances. The Habsburgs, eager for powerful allies, joined the pact, forming a strengthened version of the old Triple Alliance. Working together, Britain and Austria coordinated their strategies, the British countering Russian influence in Central Asia, the Austrians doing the same in the Balkans. Wilhelm even attempted to persuade his close friend, Tsar Nicholas II, to abandon France and join the Anglo-German bloc. In 1904, the two monarchs signed a defensive alliance in good faith, but upon Nicholas's return to St. Petersburg, Russian ministers refused to ratify it, effectively nullifying the agreement. Still, neither France nor Russia possessed the strength to challenge this new order. As time went on, cracks began to form in older partnerships. Tensions with Italy grew, and when it became clear that Rome was drifting toward hostility, Wilhelm and Emperor Franz Joseph decided not to renew their alliance with the Italians. Italy, feeling isolated, eventually turned to join what became known as the Triple Entente, aligning with France and Russia. Yet the strategic advantage remained firmly with the Anglo-German world. Under Wilhelm's dual rule, competition between the British and German navies vanished. Instead, their fleets were coordinated, the Royal Navy maintaining dominance in the Atlantic, while the German Navy projected power across the Baltic and Indian Oceans. Their colonial policies became complementary rather than competitive, and their combined economic power dwarfed that of the rest of Europe. For the moment, it appeared as though Wilhelm had achieved the impossible, the unification of two empires that once seemed destined to clash. Domestically, Wilhelm worked tirelessly to stabilize and modernize both realms. In Britain, he introduced accident insurance, pensions, child labor restrictions, and factory inspections, reforms modeled on Germany's own social welfare programs. These measures earned him unexpected admiration from British workers and labor unions. Inspired by the universal male suffrage that already existed in Germany, he pushed for expanded voting rights in Britain, where the 1884 Reform Act had still left nearly half the adult male population without the vote. Working closely with Joseph Chamberlain, the brilliant architect behind the Anglo-German Pact, Wilhelm strengthened the Conservative Party to contain the influence of the Liberals. His reforms effectively diffused the growing power of the labor movement, as many of their demands were already being met under his reign. It was a calculated blend of pragmatism and ambition, enough reform to inspire loyalty, but never so much as to threaten the existing order. Yet even Wilhelm could not escape Britain's oldest political wound, Ireland. The Home Rule question, simmering for decades, once again boiled to the surface. Ulster Unionists resisted autonomy at every turn, while Irish nationalists demanded it with growing impatience. During the 1909 budget crisis, Wilhelm sided with the Tories and defended the veto power of the House of Lords, effectively killing any chance of passing a Home Rule bill. Still, recognizing the political weight of the Irish Parliamentary Party, he conceded modest reforms that expanded Catholic representation and local authority, though these gestures did little to ease the island's deep divisions. At the same time, Wilhelm and Chamberlain turned their attention to the empire's vast, unwieldy structure. The debates over trade and tariffs had reached their peak, and Chamberlain proposed a bold new vision, an imperial federation that would unite Britain's dominions under one administrative framework. Wilhelm embraced the idea wholeheartedly. In his view, it was not merely a bureaucratic reform, but the future of global empire itself. He convened a grand imperial conference bringing together representatives from Canada, Australia, South Africa, and other dominions. From this assembly emerged a new federal council, designed to coordinate defense, trade, and diplomacy across the empire. Though ostensibly a collaborative effort, Wilhelm ensured that the structure of this new commonwealth greatly expanded his own authority. Freed from many of the parliamentary constraints of Westminster, he effectively reshaped the monarchy into a far more centralized institution. Economic integration followed swiftly. The newly established Commonwealth adopted free trade within its borders, coupled with steep tariffs against foreign competitors. Anglo-German manufacturers flourished, while other European economies struggled to keep pace. Even the Dominion's military forces were reorganized under Prussian discipline, emphasizing loyalty to the crown above all else. In Germany, Wilhelm continued his industrial expansion, modernizing production and empowering the working class. But these changes came at a cost. Traditional landowners, the Junkers, fiercely resisted his agricultural reforms, fearing that modernization would erode their influence. Yet the Kaiser's alliance with the army kept the opposition in check, and stability endured. By 1905, Wilhelm's assertive diplomacy reached a new height during the Tangier crisis, when Germany and Britain together forced France to abandon its ambitions in Morocco. The message was clear: no nation could stand against the combined might of Berlin and London. For nearly a decade, their alliance held Europe in a state of tense peace. No major power dared challenge them. But peace, as history has shown time and again, is fragile. In 1914, the world order Wilhelm had built began to unravel when his close friend, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. That single act set in motion a chain of events that would plunge the world into the Great War. And while Wilhelm's grand experiment, uniting the crowns of Britain and Germany, had brought prosperity and stability for a time, it could not escape the weight of history. The dream of a Teutonic empire spanning continents would die in the trenches of Europe. If you want to explore how history might have taken yet another path, one where Wilhelm's father, Frederick, lived longer and guided Germany and Britain toward an even stronger alliance, then stay tuned for the next video.